Omar Bradley stood in a cramped command post in Normandy, the kind of place that smelled like damp canvas, cigarette smoke, and ink. Outside, the summer air carried the low thunder of artillery that never seemed to stop. Inside, his eyes moved down casualty lists that felt heavier than any map he had ever held. It was July 18th, 1944, and the American sector had been grinding forward for 6 brutal weeks since June 6th, 1944. 6 weeks of men bleeding in the Norman hedgerows. 6 weeks of progress measured in yards. 6 weeks of units being rebuilt and broken again. Over 40,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. Numbers that weren't numbers to Bradley. They were faces. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, kids who had never seen France until they were ordered to die in it. And the most maddening part was that the enemy wasn't the only reason those lists were so long. The real disaster was sitting just a few miles to the east, behind a name that had become a curse spoken quietly in American tents. Caen. The plan for the invasion had been built like a clock over 18 months, every gear depending on another. The British and Canadians would land on the eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, and seize Caen fast. Caen mattered because it was a road junction that opened into the kind of terrain tanks could devour. Wider fields, better roads, room to maneuver. Take it quickly, and the Allies could surge inland before German armored reserves slammed into the beachhead and crushed it. Montgomery had promised that outcome with the confidence of a man who believed words could change reality. Caen would fall on D-Day itself, not the next day, not soon. He had assured Eisenhower it would be in Allied hands by nightfall on June 6, 1944, and that British forces would push south toward open ground within days. Bradley's mission was different. The Americans would land on Utah and Omaha, carve through the Cottonton Peninsula, and secure Cherbourg for logistics. It was vital work, but it was not the glamour thrust. The sharp point of the spear was supposed to be Montgomery's attack through Caen. That's how the entire scheme breathed. Speed was the oxygen. If the Allies stalled, if they sat too long, if they paused too carefully, the German panzers would arrive, and the invasion could be strangled on the beaches like a man pinned under barbed wire. When the landings came, the eastern beaches went better than many had dared hope. The British and Canadians got ashore. Casualties were lighter than expected. For a few hours, it felt like the nightmare had been cheated. Thousands of troops began moving inland. The British 3rd Infantry Division pushed south from Sword Beach, and their objective was not far, only a handful of miles. The terrain on that side, compared to the hellscape of hedgerows in the American zone, offered movement. The path to Caen was exposed. German forces in position were thin. It was one of those early war moments when history seems to hold its breath, waiting to see whether hesitation or boldness will decide everything. And then the hesitation came. Montgomery's approach, methodical, careful, controlled, had a fatal problem for a plan that demanded speed. British forces paused to consolidate the beachhead. They waited for artillery to be landed. They organized supply lines. They gathered themselves like a man checking his equipment while the enemy was still stumbling. Caution isn't always cowardice, but in that moment, caution was poison. By afternoon, German reinforcements began to appear. The 21st Panzer Division counterattacked between the British and Canadian sectors. It didn't throw the Allies back into the sea, but it did what it had to do. It broke the rhythm. It slowed the push toward Caen until night came down, and the first promise was already dead. By the end of June 6, 1944, British forces were still short of the city. Montgomery had not taken Caen on D-Day. He dismissed it like a temporary inconvenience. He told Eisenhower the delay would be brief, that the next morning would bring renewed momentum. The confidence remained, even as the facts began to harden like concrete. June 7, 1944 passed. British attacks were stopped. June 8, 1944 brought the same result. June 9, 1944, still stuck. Each day the Germans poured more strength into the Caen sector, not because of a clever British trap, but because the threat was obvious. If the British broke through there, the door into France swung open. By June 10, 1944, the reality was unavoidable. The plan's centerpiece had cracked. Caen was not going to fall quickly. That failure on the eastern flank did something worse than embarrass a commander. It shaped the entire German decision-making process. In their headquarters, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel faced the question that mattered more than any speech: where to concentrate the panzers. He had limited armor. He could not be everywhere. The British were visibly, relentlessly trying to force the Caen gateway, and if they succeeded, they could drive into open country. The Americans, by contrast, were grinding through bocage terrain, a nightmare for tanks, a maze of sunken lanes and thick hedges, small fields separated by ancient earthen banks and stone walls. For armored warfare, it was suffocation. Rommel chose the obvious danger. He concentrated German armor around Caen. Divisions arrived, one after another. The 21st Panzer was there, then the 12th SS Panzer, then Panzer Lehr, then more followed. By mid-June, the German armored presence around Caen had grown into something massive. Hundreds of tanks, some of the best units Germany had left in the West. Those tanks could have been thrown against the American beaches in the early vulnerable days, when the invasion was still organizing itself. They could have turned Bradley's sector into a catastrophe. Instead, they were locked in battle against Montgomery's repeated efforts to take Caen. Later, Montgomery would portray that outcome as genius, as if he had deliberately lured German armor to the east so the Americans could break out in the west. But in those weeks, no one watching him fight for Caen believed he was acting out a calm script. He was trying to win there. He was trying again and again, and failing again and again. Whatever strategic benefit came from German armor being fixed in place was an accident created by British inability to deliver the decisive breakthrough they had promised. And while Montgomery bled tanks outside Caen, the American army paid in men in the hedgerows. The bocage was not merely difficult terrain, it was a weapon, and the Germans used it like a scalpel. The hedgerows were centuries old, dense vegetation grown atop earthen banks that could rise higher than a man's head. The roots were thick enough to resist the weight of tanks. When a Sherman tried to climb, it lifted its belly toward the sky, exposing thin armor like a target board. German anti-tank gunners waited for that moment and fired into the soft underside. Infantry attacks were worse. American soldiers advanced across open fields toward hedges they couldn't see through, toward muzzle flashes that appeared and vanished. Machine guns covered the narrow lanes. Mortars dropped shells from positions hidden by terrain and foliage. Mines waited in the grass, and if the Americans fought their way to one hedgerow, another waited a short distance ahead. It was a battlefield designed to bleed the attacker dry. Bradley understood exactly what the trap meant. American advantages in armor and air power were being neutralized. Airstrikes couldn't always see targets. Tanks couldn't move freely. Maneuver, the American strength, became impossible. Every field turned into a fortress. Every advance was a frontal fight. Units took catastrophic losses for tiny gains. The casualty lists Bradley read on July 18, 1944, were the receipts for a campaign that had gone wrong at its very starting line. And the bitter truth, the one no one wanted to say too loudly in public, was that the Americans were dying inside a stalemate made worse by Montgomery's broken promise. If Caen had been taken quickly, the front would have opened. Space would have existed for movement. German defenses would have been forced to shift and stretch. But with Caen in German hands week after week, the Allies were contained, and the Americans were trapped in the bocage like men fighting inside a cage. Montgomery kept promising a solution. One offensive would be the decisive one. A bigger attack, more artillery, more tanks, more pressure. June 26, 1944, brought Operation Epsom, a major British attempt west of Caen to encircle the city. It began with massive artillery preparation and a confident push forward. It looked, from a distance, like the kind of weight that should crush defenses. But the Germans were dug in and ready. Panzer divisions countered. Infantry held. The British gained ground in painful increments, and by June 30, 1944, Epsom had failed to produce the breakthrough Montgomery needed. A salient crossed the Odon, but exploitation never came. German counterattacks threatened to cut it off. The advance turned into more consolidation, more digging in, more slow grinding. Pressure rose everywhere. Churchill grew furious. British newspapers questioned Montgomery's competence openly. Eisenhower met with him on July 1, 1944, and the tension in that meeting wasn't hidden behind smiles. Eisenhower needed results. Bradley needed relief. The Americans could not stay in the hedgerows forever, bleeding themselves out while the invasion's promised momentum died. Montgomery promised another offensive, bigger, heavier, unstoppable. It would use heavy bombers to smash German positions. It would be called Goodwood. It would begin in mid-July. This time, he said, he would not fail. Then came July 18, 1944, and the sky over Caen filled with aircraft. It was the largest air bombardment the Allies had yet used in support of ground operations. Thousands of bombers dropping thousands of tons of explosives on German positions east of the city. The earth shook. Forward defenses were torn apart. British armor, hundreds of tanks, moved into the ruined landscape, and for a few hours it looked like the breakthrough had finally arrived. Montgomery sent optimistic messages upward. He spoke of retreating Germans, of the line breaking, of momentum returning, and then the trap snapped shut. German units that had avoided the worst of the bombing, particularly the dreaded 88mm guns hidden in villages and behind rises, began firing into the advancing armor. The British tanks rolled into killing zones where long-range fire chewed through them. Surviving panzers took positions and countered. The advance slowed, then stalled. By the end of that day, the dream of a clean breakthrough was bleeding out in smoke. Over the next 2 days, British forces lost hundreds of tanks in their attempt to force the issue. Goodwood did not deliver what it had promised. It did not shatter German defenses. It did not open the route to open country. It produced another costly stalemate. When Montgomery called off the offensive on July 20, 1944, he claimed victory anyway. He spoke of ground gained, German losses inflicted, objectives achieved. But Eisenhower could see the larger picture, and so could every American commander watching the clock. Montgomery had promised a breakthrough and delivered devastation without decision. The credibility that mattered, the kind that shapes operational control, was gone. Then, almost immediately, Montgomery began telling a new story. He implied he had never truly intended to break through at Caen. His true aim, he said, had been to hold German armor in place. Every panzer fighting the British was a panzer not fighting the Americans. This, he claimed, had been his plan all along. The attacks weren't failures. They were deliberate battles of attrition meant to fix German attention while the Americans prepared the real breakout. The problem was that the record didn't match the performance. The original promises, the planning documents, the direct orders, the repeated attempts to seize Caen quickly. None of it read like a man content to hold the enemy. It read like a man trying to win the decisive battle and failing to do it. The new narrative was politically brilliant. It protected his reputation and let him claim credit for an American success that was now approaching. But it infuriated the men who had watched their soldiers die in the hedgerows while Montgomery tried to force a door that would not open. Eisenhower could not publicly call him a liar without fracturing the alliance. The optics mattered. Britain mattered. The war demanded unity even when commanders despised one another. So Eisenhower did what politics often forces in war. He swallowed the narrative outwardly and adjusted power quietly. The Americans would plan their own breakout. If Montgomery wanted to claim he had orchestrated it, he could do so after the Germans had been beaten. Bradley had been preparing for that moment. His plan was Operation Cobra, a concentrated American blow near St. Lo. Heavy bombers would carpet bomb a narrow strip of German front line, ripping it apart. Infantry and armor would punch through the stunned defenders. And once a gap opened, the Allies would pour through into the open country beyond the bocage, where American mobility, logistics, and air superiority could finally dominate. Bradley also had one hidden advantage created by Montgomery's failure. German armor was still heavily concentrated near Caen, tied down by British pressure, whether intentional or not. The German infantry facing the Americans could fight hard, but they lacked the same armored punch that could seal a breach quickly. If Cobra succeeded, speed would be everything. The Germans would try to react. They would try to shift panzers west. The Allies would have to be faster than that shift. And here, on the American side, something else had been changing quietly at the lowest levels. American soldiers adapted, improvised, learned. A sergeant named Curtis Coolin took scrap steel from German beach obstacles and welded it onto Sherman tanks, creating crude prongs that could rip through hedgerows instead of climbing them. Rhino tanks. It wasn't elegant, but war rewards what works. It was American ingenuity responding to a terrain that had been devouring men. Still, even with new tools, Cobra needed the right kind of commander to exploit. Success? Someone who would not pause and consolidate at the moment the enemy was wobbling. Someone who would keep pushing until fuel ran out or a direct order forced him to stop. Bradley knew exactly who that man was. George S. Patton, the most aggressive mobile commander the Americans had. Patton was already in Normandy by mid-July, studying maps, planning routes, anticipating what he would do the moment the line broke. His Third Army would become operational on August 1st, 1944, but his mind was already racing ahead of the calendar. Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944. The bombing was enormous, heavy bombers and medium bombers dropping thousands of tons of explosives on a strip of front line. German positions were shattered. Communications collapsed. Survivors stumbled through dust and shock. Then American infantry attacked, moving across cratered ground, pushing into the wreckage. Resistance was uneven and disorganized. The line that had held for weeks finally tore open. Over July 26, 1944, and July 27, 1944, the breach widened. More divisions poured forward. German counterattacks faltered. The defensive structure in western Normandy began to collapse like a wall with its foundation kicked out. By July 28, 1944, American forces reached open country beyond the bocage. After weeks of strangled movement, they were finally in terrain where tanks could maneuver and where air power could strike effectively. It was the kind of operational freedom Montgomery had promised to create through Caen. The Germans tried to rush reinforcements from Brittany, but they could not easily peel away the armored strength massed in the east. By July 31, 1944, the Normandy stalemate was broken. The Americans had done what the British had not. Then came August 1, 1944, and Patton's Third Army officially went into action. On paper, his mission was to swing west into Brittany, take ports, and then reorganize. Patton looked at the collapsing German situation and saw something more immediate. An enemy in retreat, roads opening, a chance to transform a breakout into a route. Ports would matter if the war dragged on, but if the war could be accelerated, if German forces could be encircled and shattered, Patton believed the war could be shortened before ports even became critical. He made a decision that fit his nature. He sent one corps toward Brittany to satisfy the letter of his instructions and pushed the rest east toward the heart of France. Bradley understood what Patton was doing and, rather than choke it, quietly allowed it. Eisenhower was effectively informed after Patton's momentum was already in motion. And by then, the problem wasn't whether Patton should be stopped. It was whether anyone could stop him without destroying the very advantage the Allies had finally gained. Patton's columns advanced with a speed that made maps look outdated. Towns were liberated so quickly that German defenders were often caught off guard, unable to establish new lines. Patton's armor cut off retreat routes, pushed through gaps before the Germans could plug them, and turned withdrawal into chaos. In a matter of days, then weeks, Patton covered distances that made the earlier Normandy slog look like a different war. By mid-August, Third Army had surged far beyond what anyone expected. The contrast became humiliating. The British had spent weeks hammering at Caen. Patton moved like a blade through open country, making mobility the language of victory again. That is when Montgomery's political instincts returned in full force. He began claiming credit publicly. He told media that the American breakout succeeded because German armor had been held in place near Caen, because his battles had fixed the panzers. Bradley and Patton, he implied, were carrying out the larger plan he had shaped. To American commanders, it sounded like a man rewriting history while the blood was still wet on the ground. Because the Americans who had fought in Normandy remembered the cost. They remembered the hedgerows. They remembered the casualty lists. They remembered that if Caen had fallen quickly as promised, the breakout might have come earlier, and thousands of American casualties in the bocage might never have happened. They weren't debating pride. They were debating lives. As the Allies surged across France, the question of Normandy's truth did not disappear. After the war, interrogations and testimonies from German generals added sharp clarity to what had been argued in Allied headquarters. German commanders explained that they concentrated armor near Caen because that is where the British were attacking. They treated those attacks as real breakthrough attempts, especially Goodwood, with its immense bombardment and massed armor. They did not describe a clever British deception trapping them in place. They described hard fighting and stubborn defense against a threat they could not ignore. The panzers were there because Caen mattered, and because the British were trying to take it. Not because the Germans were fooled into cooperation with a British master plan. And then, the numbers spoke too. In the language numbers always speak when politics tries to bury them. The American First Army suffered enormous casualties in Normandy. Units were gutted and rebuilt. Infantry losses were particularly severe in the bocage, where riflemen were consumed in a battlefield designed to favor defense. As the summer wore on, The strain became so intense that the U.S. Army began scraping for manpower in ways it had not anticipated, pushing men from support roles toward the front to fill gaps. It was a desperate measure driven by the brutal arithmetic of hedgerow fighting. When the breakout finally restored mobility, the casualty rate shifted. Mobile warfare favored the side with superior air power and logistics, and the Americans could finally apply those strengths properly. The bocage had been the defenders' paradise. Weeks spent trapped there multiplied the cost. That is why, when history is stripped of polite phrasing, the contrast becomes unavoidable. One commander promised a swift capture of Caen on D-Day and could not deliver it after weeks of effort. Another commander, once the breach was opened, exploited with such force and speed that the entire campaign transformed. One man's caution became a chain around the Allied ankle. Another man's aggression turned a crack into a collapse. And in the end, the Normandy campaign succeeded, but not in the way the original promise had claimed. It succeeded because the Americans broke out where they had been pinned, because they adapted to terrain that was killing them, and because once the door opened, Patton sprinted through it with an instinct for momentum that no one else matched. Montgomery could claim, afterward, that everything had happened according to plan. He could drape the result in strategic language and present his failures as intention. But Bradley's casualty lists on July 18, 1944, were not strategy. They were evidence. Evidence of a promise made on June 6, 1944, and broken while American soldiers paid the price in blood.